My name is Alex Weicker, and I'm the owner and principal attorney at Amigos Immigration Law and Services. I've represented clients at hundreds of USCIS interviews all over the United States, and today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what really happens at a spousal green card interview. I'm going to go over the documents that you should prepare to bring with you to the interview, and I'll give you some tips and tricks so that you can succeed at your interview. First of all, I'm just going to assume that you've already parked, gotten past security, or in the building, and have gotten taken back to the interviewing officer's office. It should be two people. It should be the petitioner and the beneficiary of the petition should be interviewed together. If this is a separation interview, I'll cover that a little bit later. Separation interview is when the couple is interviewed separately by the officer. So when you get into the office, the first thing that you want to do, if you have an attorney and the attorney is not present physically with you, then you need to request that the officer call your attorney. Now, sometimes an officer will say, well, your case is easy. You don't need your attorney to be here. You could politely refuse and have them call your attorney. They should have the contact information on file with the G28. Otherwise, you should have brought the G28 with you so that you can give it to them and have them call your attorney. If your attorney's in the room, the attorney will be either sitting next to you and your spouse or behind you in the room. If they put your attorney in the back corner far away from you, you should again politely request that they sit closer to you because you are allowed to communicate and counsel with your attorney at the interview. At the outset of the interview, they're going to have you and your spouse, you should provide your photo identification. This can be driver's license. It can also be passports. So provide that to them so that they know who you are. If they have not taken your biometrics outside, they may also take your biometrics at the interview. That means they will take your fingerprints, so your index fingers, and take your picture just to verify who you are. There's no problem with this. It happens at every interview. After that's done, they're going to have the two of you raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth, and the interview will begin. Okay, at this point, if you have prepared documents supporting your case, you can hand them over to the officer, or you can wait until later to give them to the officer. In my opinion, I tend to recommend that you wait to give documents until the officer actually requests them. However, if the officer does not request documents, then you need to affirmatively recommend that they take your documents. A couple things happen at the interview, may happen in different orders, but the general events of your spousal green card interview are they're going to review the documents and the filings. So they're going to review the I-130 and the I-130A, and they will review the I-485, which is your green card application. They will also ask questions about the bona fides of the relationship. Those are the primary parts of the interview. They may happen in different orders, but they all happen at the interview. If you filed an I-765, a work permit application, or an I-131, an application for a parole document with your filing, they will not be adjudicated at the green card interview. So you don't need to worry about them. One of the first things that I like to ask at the beginning of the interview is if the I-864, which is the affidavit of support, and there may be more than one that you filed, I would ask if this has been approved already. Sometimes these are adjudicated by a service center prior to interview. Sometimes officers will tell you it is, sometimes they won't tell you. But if they tell you it has been adjudicated, then you don't need to worry about providing supporting documentation for the I-864. It can save you some time and some effort. Usually the first thing that happens at the interview is they're going to review the I-130 and then the I-130A. This is the petition that is filed by the United States citizen or the lawful permanent resident for the non-citizen. I recommend that you look over your I-130, I-130A, and I-485 ahead of time so that you're familiar with the information that is on these applications. You should not only review your information, but you should also review the information of your spouse. Some officers like to use asking questions on the I-130 and the I-485 as a way of testing the bona fides of your relationship. So, for instance, they may ask one spouse, about the other spouse's biographical information, which on the forms includes their full name, address, parents' names, date of birth, children's names, children's dates of births, and so on. You should be familiar with this information. Now, if any information has changed or if there's any typos on the forms or wrong answers on the application forms, this is your opportunity to update that information. There is no penalty for making changes to your application at the interview. However, if there is a very important change that needs to be made, for instance, your address is wrong or a name is misspelled, and you do not change it at the interview, that could be a very costly mistake. It could cause you a lot of time and money afterwards in order to fix your green card that had a mistake due to your own error. One of the most important parts of the I-485, which is the green card application, is at the end of it, the security questions. There's a number of yes or no questions where they ask you for information about whether you've ever been a terrorist, whether you've ever trafficked in weapons or drugs or had family members who had, if you've been a prostitute, if you've ever been in removal proceedings and so on and so forth. Make sure you're familiar with these questions, make sure you understand these questions, and make sure that your answers on your application are in fact correct. If they're not, then you really need to inform the officer about this information at the interview. One of the key questions on the I-485 has to do with criminal history. A number of applicants have some criminal history, which may include traffic incidents and so on. I always tell my clients that they should disclose traffic infractions, speeding, parking tickets, and so on. It doesn't hurt, but what it does do is that it shows that you're being forthright and honest with the officer. Whenever the officer is going through these questions, this is the time that you would provide supporting documentation. So for instance, if you had traffic infractions or a criminal record, you would want to provide your criminal documents at this time. Criminal documents always need to be either certified copies or original. If you're not sure exactly what documents you need to provide, that would be a good reason to have an immigration attorney present, or at least you should have consulted with one to know exactly what should be on the record, what maybe you don't need to put on the record. In a little bit here, I'm going to go over exactly what list of documents I'd like to bring to the green card interview. Assuming you go through all of the applications and petitions and all the information is up to date, the next part is going to be talking about the bona fides of your relationship. In this part, the officer will ask you and your spouse some questions about your relationship. Now, the questions can vary, but there are some key questions that are normally asked at the interview. In most interviews, they will ask you, when and how did you meet? When and how did you get engaged? Tell me about your wedding. When did it take place? Where was it? Who was there? How many people attended? How did your relationship develop from your meeting to wanting to get married? These are very, very common questions. Almost every interview will ask these questions. Additional questions that come up pretty often are, what is your spouse's job? What days of the week does your spouse work? How does your spouse get to and from work? Tell me about your house. Where do you live? Who else lives there with you? How many bedrooms are there? What is garbage day? Have you ever met your spouse's parents? Have you ever met your spouse's children? How did you meet them? When did you meet them? Does your spouse have any brothers and sisters? And so on. These are very, very common questions. So it is to your benefit to know a little bit about your spouse's family. Most of the questions that they ask are things that married couples tend to know. Who pays the bills? Your joint checking account. Why do you use it? Why not? Better prepared your application is whenever you file it. So the more documents and the more thorough your documents are whenever you file, usually the fewer questions they're going to ask at the interview. Okay? If you have children together, they may not ask a lot of questions at the interview. It's only whenever there is some doubt as to the bona fides of your relationship. And such doubt, it can be raised by a number of suspicions. There's really no rule that's been published, but in my experience, if you and your spouse have a very big age difference, there's racial differences, if the non-citizen is from a number of countries that tend to have high fraud rates, and I don't really know what the official list is, but I find that clients that are from Jamaica, Nigeria, a number of other African nations, Ukraine, Philippines, these countries tend to be grilled a little bit harder at their green card interview than people who are from, say, Western Europe. It's not fair, but it's true. So you should be a little more prepared if you're from one of these countries. Anyway, they can ask any questions that they want. Just answer the best you can. If you don't know the answer, just tell them, I'm not sure. Or if they ask you something that you don't remember, you should say, I don't remember. If you tell them something that is not true because you forgot it or something, they're going to take that information as being true. So it's better to let them know that you forgot something or you don't recall something. Your spouse is there. Your spouse can help you out a little bit on some questions. It's okay for you to have some spousal banter during the interview and give some general spousal help. But if your spouse is answering all of the questions for you, that could be problematic. So generally, you should answer your own questions. Now, one thing that happens sometimes is there is a separation interview. A separation interview is when the USCIS agent takes each spouse separately and interviews them. After one spouse is done, they'll call the other spouse back and interview them. In this situation, it is really, really helpful to have an attorney. Okay. Whenever I attend these interviews, I sit down and I will write notes and I will write down every single question and every single answer that is talked about during the interview for each spouse. And then at the end of the interview for both spouses, I always ask that the officer bring the couple back together and they talk about any discrepancies that might have come up during the separation interview. The separation interview, they're going to ask each spouse the exact same questions. The questions are going to be the same ones that I just went through, or they might be a little more detailed. Just try not to get nervous, do the best that you can. And again, it's really important that you review your and your spouse's applications ahead of time to be familiar with information that maybe you should know, but you've forgotten. I also recommend that couples write a marital statement before the interview, because the interviews sometimes take place a year or so after you actually file your application, and it's very easy to forget details. If you've written a marital statement at the time that you filed your application, by the time the interview comes around, it can be easier to refresh your memory as to the details. Assuming the interview goes well, the officer may or may not tell you if the applications have been approved. Sometimes the officer cannot give this information. Sometimes they need to relook at the file. It's not uncommon for the officer to say a decision is going to be mailed. If that happens, it may be 1 to 2 weeks, maybe a month for them to give you a decision. When the decision comes out, if you have an online account, you'll know immediately. If you get paper filings, then you'll get a notice in the mail that tells you whether or not the case has been approved. If your case is approved, you get a green card in the mail, probably a couple weeks, depending on how screwed up USCIS at that particular time in history. Last thing I want to talk about, the documents that you want to prepare for the interview. Okay, I usually tell my clients to organize their documents with at least 3 folders. Okay, sometimes 4 folders, but at least 3 folders. And you can do it any way you want, but the purpose is that you want to have your documents well organized for the interview. If you have a big jumble of messy, crumpled papers, the interview might be a little bit nervous. And rifling around through this pile of papers is going to make you even more nervous. And you may not be able to find exactly what you want to find to give to the officer. So by organizing your folders, your files, your papers, it helps you be prepared and be calm. In the first folder, I recommend that people put their original biographical documents. So this is going to be your ID cards, your I-94s, your passports. If you have more than one passport that you've used since you entered the United States, you want to have them all. You want to have all of your entry stamps, especially your most recent entry stamp. If you have one, you definitely want to have your I-94. You want to have your original marriage certificate. If there have been any prior marriages, you want to have the original, either judicial rulings or death certificates, the original documents showing that those prior marriages have been terminated. The spouse, if they're a United States citizen or permanent resident, needs to bring original proof that they're United States citizen or permanent resident. So their green card or their United States birth certificate, US passport, naturalization certificate, certificate of citizenship, and so on. I also recommend that a birth certificate be provided as well, even if you're providing proof that is a passport for your US citizenship. If there are any children involved, you also want to bring the original birth certificates for the children. Now, even children that are not of the relationship, I tend to recommend that people bring those birth certificates as well. They may be stepchildren. There may be a reason to consider them. All documents provided need to have a certified English translation. And if there's anything that you have not provided to USCIS already, you want to make sure that you bring a backup copy. Backup copy is important because many USCIS officers either won't have the time or they won't have a copy machine ready to make a copy for you of your documents at the interview. So if you hand it over to them, you may not get it back easily. And these are important documents. So that's the first folder. Second folder, I recommend people bring originals of documents that have already been submitted to USCIS. So whenever you filed your application, you probably attached a number of documents. I usually file copies. This way, original documents can be kept at home and then bring the originals to the interview. So this may be photographs, this may be other official documents, leases, and so on. Make sure that you have the originals handy. These documents, usually they're not asked for by the officer, but it's nice to have them just in case they want verification. The third folder is for new documents that have not been submitted. So new documents usually go to the bona fides of your relationship. Again, with processing times as slow as they are, it may be a year or more from the time that you filed to the time that you have an interview. And that time, a lot may have happened in your relationship. You should have kept records of everything that happened and then bring these documents to the interview. Proof of the bona fides of your relationship can take many forms. I usually recommend that first and foremost, you want to have continuity of addresses on your documents. So your driver's licenses, ID cards should have the same marital address if you are living together. Your other documents, such as your bank statements, credit cards, bills, so on, they should also have the same marital address where you currently reside. You should bring updates of bills, proof that you live together, proof that you have joint ownership of property, and proof that you have commingled financial resources. These are really common examples of the bona fides of your marriage. Updated photographs, updated social media. If you have them, if you have pets together, I really recommend that you bring proof that you are raising a pet together, pictures, veterinary records that have both your names on it. Really, it can be a lot of different things. Greeting cards, text messages, prepare as much as you can. And if you have any questions, you can always ask your attorney, or if you have other questions, you can shoot a question to us online at alex@amigos.com or info@amigos.com, and we'll try to help you out. The fourth folder is where I would put financial documents. Now, if I-864 has already been approved, you're not going to have to hand over financial documents. Financial documents tend to be very sensitive for a lot of my clients. So if you don't have to put them on the record and give them to the government, then don't. But it's better to have them prepared just in case than to be not prepared. So the financial documents that you want to bring would be your tax documents. If you're married, you should be married filing jointly. It not only is that proof, it's an extra bona fide for your relationship, but I mean, it also shows that you've been filing your taxes, and updated taxes may be necessary for the I-864 affidavit of support. Along with the tax documents, you want to bring the supporting documents for the taxes. Those would be W-2s, 1099s, or the relevant schedules. If you have other income, such as Social Security disability, veterans benefits, child support, alimony, investment income, or other income that would not be disclosed on your taxes, then you should also bring that, particularly if your income is borderline for being sufficient to file an affidavit of support. Again, you only need to bring updated documents, not the ones that have already been filed. It may be helpful also to bring pay stubs, maybe 6 months of pay stubs for the petitioner or joint sponsor, if there is a joint sponsor. If you don't have an employment contract, you may want to bring a letter from your employer stating what your position is, what your annual salary is. That should be on letterhead and signed by the employer with a date. That's pretty much it. That should help you out. If you have all of those things ready for your interview, then you're well prepared, and you hopefully should be approved and become a lawful permanent resident. One last thing is, if you have been married within 2 years of the date of the approval of your green card, then your green card will be a conditional 2-year green card. If you've been married more than 2 years at the time that your green card is approved, you'll be issued a 10-year green card. If you're being issued a conditional green card, the officer needs to give you advisals that your conditions need to be removed within 2 years of receiving the green card. So that means within 2 years, usually 1 year and 9 months, you can file the I-751, have the conditions removed. Basically, for that, you're going to have to refile all the bona fides that you have accumulated over those 2 years all over again. So good luck. Thank you for your time, and welcome to the United States.